The Ozark Mountains in 1907 were a quiet place, the kind of quiet that held both peace and danger. The air smelled of pine and smoke from wood stoves, and the hills rolled endlessly, swallowing sound. People there lived simple lives, farmers, hunters, and families who'd been rooted in those lands for generations. They rose with the sun, worked until dusk, and prayed the forest stayed kind. But under that stillness, there was always a strange feeling that the woods were watching. The small settlement near Hollow Creek was a handful of cabins spread along a dirt road that twisted between the hills. It wasn't even a real town. There was no sheriff, no schoolhouse, and the only church had burned down 3 years earlier and was never rebuilt. Outsiders rarely came through. Those who did often said the people in Hollow Creek had a different way of looking at you, like they were measuring your soul before deciding if you should stay. It was the kind of place where people depended on each other to survive, but also kept their secrets close. Every family had its own story, and every story had something that didn't quite add up. Some said that's just how mountain people were, proud, private, and bound by silence. But others whispered that the silence itself was dangerous. In the winter of 1907, snow came early and heavily, sealing off most of the trails. The mountains looked beautiful from a distance, soft, white, and calm, but those who lived there knew better. When the cold came, it brought hunger, sickness, and sometimes madness. That winter, the people of Hollow Creek would learn that evil didn't always come from the woods. Sometimes it lived among them, wearing a familiar face. At the heart of the story was a family that had lived in Hollow Creek longer than anyone could remember. The father, a tall man with calloused hands and a temper that ran short, worked the land with the help of his eldest son. His wife was quiet, almost ghost-like, moving through her days with the patience of someone who had stopped expecting kindness. They had 3 children, all born on the same stretch of land, all taught to fear God and mind their father. To anyone passing through, they looked like a hardworking mountain family. But to those who paid attention, something about their house always felt off, too silent, too tense, too full of eyes that didn't meet. Then there was their neighbor, a younger man who had moved into an abandoned cabin near the creek 2 years earlier. No one knew much about him, only that he came from somewhere up north and didn't talk about his past. He was polite, quiet, and strong, the kind of man who could fix a fence in a blizzard or pull a calf from a frozen river. The local women said he was gentle. The men said he was strange. There were others, too, a widow who ran a small trade post from her front porch, a traveling preacher who came through every few months and left as quickly as he arrived, and a boy who'd taken to wandering the woods at night, saying he heard voices calling his name. Each of them would soon be part of what happened, though none could have known how deeply they'd be pulled into the darkness that was coming. That darkness began quietly, as it often does. It started with the sound of screams echoing through the trees one night, high, sharp, and short-lived. Then came the whispers of missing livestock, strange footprints in the snow, and the sound of digging where no one should have been digging. People started locking their doors, though most of them didn't even have keys. Children were kept inside. Lamps burned longer into the night. The first real sign that something was wrong came one morning when the eldest boy from the family by the creek didn't show up at the trading post. He was supposed to deliver firewood. His father said he'd gone hunting early, but by evening, when the snow turned pink in the sunset, the boy still hadn't returned. That night, the dogs howled nonstop. At first, people said it was a wolf that took him. The woods were full of them that winter. But others said it wasn't a wolf, it was something worse. The widow swore she saw someone digging by the creek the night before, long after the moon had risen. The neighbor said he heard laughter, a kind that didn't sound human. The preacher called it the devil testing their faith. The father said nothing. He just kept his eyes on the woods, his jaw tight, his hand on his rifle. But behind the silence of that mountain community were smaller, more human fears, jealousy, betrayal, and secrets that had been buried long before the snow fell. People started remembering the small things they'd ignored. The bruises on the mother's arms, the way the eldest son avoided going home before dark, the whispers between the neighbor and the wife at the well. It all started to make a strange kind of sense, though no one dared to say it aloud. The mountains had seen their share of deaths before, hunting accidents, illness, starvation, but this was different. This was personal. And as the days passed and the missing boy's trail grew cold under the snow, something shifted in Hollow Creek. Eyes began to turn toward one another. Trust began to rot, and deep in those woods, under the shadow of the pines, something or someone waited. No one knew it yet, but the events that would follow would leave Hollow Creek scarred forever. The snow would melt, the creek would run red, and by the time spring came, half the town would be gone. All that would remain were the stories, and even those would change depending on who told them. But one truth would stay the same. The terror that began that winter was not from nature or beasts or curses. It came from the hearts of the people themselves. Winter in the Ozarks did something to people. The longer it lingered, the more it pressed on their minds like the cold was trying to crawl inside them. The folks of Hollow Creek had lived through hard seasons before, but this one felt different. The snow was thicker, the nights darker, and after the eldest boy vanished, no one could shake the sense that something was deeply wrong. The father still went about his work as if nothing had happened, but the way he moved, slow, tense, watching everything, told another story. His wife barely spoke, her eyes hollow, her hands shaking when she poured water from the kettle. And the neighbor by the creek, the quiet man everyone used to trust, had started avoiding people altogether. Rumors spread fast in Hollow Creek. They always had. Some said the boy ran off, maybe to St. Louis, maybe to escape his father's temper. Others whispered that the neighbor knew more than he let on. The widow at the trading post claimed she saw him carrying something heavy wrapped in a blanket the night after the boy went missing. When asked about it, he said it was firewood. But the snow had fallen clean that evening. There wasn't a mark on the ground where he said he'd been cutting trees. The father's anger grew with each passing day. He stopped speaking to the few neighbors who came by. When the preacher tried to pray with him, the man slammed the door in his face. His youngest boy started crying in his sleep, muttering his brother's name. His wife begged him to leave Hollow Creek for a while to find work in town, but he wouldn't hear it. "This land's ours," he'd say, his eyes cold. "Ain't no one running me off my own soil." But deep down, he was scared not of the woods or the wolves, but of what people might start saying if the truth ever came out. He knew he hadn't been a kind man. He'd raised his children with the same iron hand his own father used on him. He told himself it was the only way to keep them strong. But he also knew he'd lost control one too many times, especially with the eldest boy. There, been shouting, and sometimes worse. That night before the boy disappeared, they'd fought again, hard enough for the neighbors to hear. The next morning, the boy was gone. The mother carried that guilt like a shadow. She knew more than she could say, and it ate at her. Every night she'd sit by the window, staring into the woods, whispering his name like a prayer. Some nights she swore she saw someone moving through the trees, a shape that looked too familiar. When she told her husband, he said she was losing her mind. But there was fear in his voice, too. The neighbor, his name was Elias, started noticing strange things around his cabin. Footprints in the snow that weren't his, a dead rabbit nailed to his door, whispers in the woods when he went out to chop firewood. He, once been close to the family, helped them fix fences, shared meals, even taught the eldest boy how to fish. But after the boy vanished, he couldn't bring himself to visit anymore. People were starting to look at him differently, and the way the father stared at him across the fields made him feel hunted. It didn't help that Elias had a secret of his own. He'd come to Hollow Creek to escape something, a fight, a death, a mistake. No one knew the details, only that he'd left his old life behind up north and never spoke of it. He hoped the mountains would bury his past, but now it felt like the past had found him again. And then there was the wife, the quiet woman with sad eyes. She'd come by his cabin a few times after her son went missing, always when her husband was gone. She said she needed flour or kerosene, but her hands trembled when he handed her the goods. One evening, she stayed longer than usual. She told Elias she didn't believe her boy had run away. She said she'd heard something that night, a scream, then a gunshot. Elias didn't know what to say. He wanted to believe her, but the look in her eyes told him she already knew the truth. It wasn't wolves. It wasn't the woods. It was something inside that house. And now she was afraid her husband might turn on her next. The widow, too, began to feel the shift in the air. She'd seen enough in her life to recognize the signs of something about to snap. Men came to her trading post with short tempers and empty eyes. People whispered in corners, glancing toward the family's cabin as if it held all the answers. Even the preacher seemed uneasy, leaving town sooner than usual, muttering that the Lord's light doesn't reach those hills anymore. As winter dragged on, hunger began to bite at everyone. Food was running low and tempers grew shorter. The father accused Elias of stealing one of his hogs. Elias denied it, but the argument turned violent. The widow saw the two men in the middle of the road, shouting, the father's hands gripping his rifle. Elias didn't back down. "You want to know where your boy went?" he shouted. "Look closer to home." The words hit like a spark in dry hay. That night the father sat alone in his cabin, staring at the fire. His wife stayed silent in the corner, her face pale. The children huddled together in their beds. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. He replayed those words in his mind, "Look closer to home." Maybe Elias was just trying to get under his skin, or maybe he knew something. Maybe someone had told him. His hand twitched toward the rifle resting against the wall. Meanwhile, Elias was fighting his own demons. He'd come to Hollow Creek to start over, but the ghosts of his past were loud now, a fight with a man who'd ended up dead, a woman's face he couldn't forget, and the shame that followed him no matter how far he ran. When he saw his wife again, standing at the edge of his property in the snow, he knew something was coming. She looked different this time, desperate, determined. She said she couldn't stay in that house any longer. That her husband had been talking to himself, digging holes in the frozen ground behind the barn. Elias told her to leave before it was too late, but where could she go? There was no town close enough, no money to her name, and no one willing to cross her husband. The tension reached its peak when another child from Hollow Creek went missing, a little girl from the widow's family. She'd gone out to fetch water and never came back. The tracks in the snow led toward the creek but vanished halfway down the hill. The search went on for days. The whole town joined in, even the father and Elias. But when the girl's bonnet was found caught in a thicket near the family's land, the whispers started again, sharper, louder. This time they weren't about wolves, they were about men. The father blamed Elias, said he was trying to destroy his family, that he was the devil in disguise. Elias said the father was hiding something far worse. The air in Hollow Creek became thick with suspicion. People who once shared meals now crossed the road to avoid one another. And all the while, the wife's fear grew into something else, anger. She'd spent her life following her husband's rules, taking his blows, burying her pain. But now she could barely look at him without trembling. She started writing in secret, short notes she hid in the floorboards, letters no one would ever read. In them, she confessed everything, her love for Elias, her guilt over her son, and her hatred for the man she'd married. Then came the night that changed everything. The snow was falling hard, wind was howling through the trees. The father hadn't spoken a word in 2 days. The wife heard him moving around outside long after midnight. She watched from the window as he walked toward the barn, shovel in hand, a lantern swinging at his side. She didn't know if he meant to bury something or dig something up. But when she saw the rifle slung over his shoulder, she knew it wasn't the ground he was after, it was Elias. She ran into the storm without her coat, feet sinking into the snow, breath tearing through her throat. Down by the creek, a faint light glowed from Elias' cabin. He was inside, asleep by the fire, unaware of the footsteps coming his way. By the time she reached his door, she could already hear shouting, the kind of shouting that didn't stop until blood was spilled. That night, Hollow Creek woke to the sound of a single gunshot echoing through the valley, a sound that didn't stop ringing for years to come. What happened next would tear the town apart, exposing every secret it had tried to bury. But by then, it was already too late. The darkness that had been building all winter had finally broken loose, and no one in those mountains would ever be the same again. The storm that night was unlike anything Hollow Creek had seen all winter. The snow fell sideways, wind howling through the pines like 1,000 screams. The world outside was a blur of white and shadow, the kind that made you lose all sense of direction. Inside Elias' cabin, the fire burned low, its orange glow flickering against the walls. He'd been half asleep in a chair, boots still on, his rifle leaning nearby. The sound of the storm almost covered the crunch of footsteps outside, almost. When the first knock came, it wasn't gentle. It was sharp, desperate. Elias opened his eyes, head heavy, unsure if he'd imagined it. Then came the second, louder, frantic. He grabbed his rifle and went to the door. Through the gap, he saw her, the wife, pale and shaking, her dress soaked through, snow clinging to her hair. "He's coming," she gasped, voice breaking. "Please, Elias, he's coming." Before he could ask who, the wind carried another sound, boots pounding through the snow, a man shouting her name. It was the father. His voice tore through the storm like thunder. "You think you can hide from me?" he roared. "You think I don't know what you've done?" Elias pulled her inside and barred the door. The cabin felt suddenly too small, too quiet. The fire crackled. The woman's breath came in gasps, her hands clutching Elias' arm. Outside, the father's shadow moved past the window, a dark shape, a lantern swinging in his hand. He circled the cabin like a wolf scenting blood. "Come out, Elias," he called. "Be a man and face me, or I'll burn this place down with both of you in it." Elias' heart hammered in his chest. He wasn't a violent man by nature, but the sight of that woman, trembling, terrified, pulled something out of him he didn't recognize. He had tried to stay out of their troubles, tried to do what was right, but he knew there was no talking this man down. The storm outside wasn't half as dangerous as the one waiting beyond that door. The woman begged him to run. "Please," she said, "he won't stop until one of you's dead." But Elias couldn't leave her. He'd seen too much fear in her eyes for too long. Then the door rattled once, twice, and burst open. The father stood in the doorway, snow swirling around him, his lantern light slicing through the dark. His face was twisted, eyes wild, beard crusted with ice. The rifle in his hands gleamed in the firelight. For a moment none of them moved. The air felt frozen, thick with hatred and fear. Then the father spoke, low and sharp. "You took my boy, you took my wife, now I'm taking you." Elias stepped forward, hands raised. "You're wrong," he said, voice steady. "No one took your boy, you did." The words hit like a blade. The father's breath hitched, eyes narrowing. "You calling me a liar?" he growled. "I'm calling you a killer," Elias said. That was all it took. The father's finger twitched on the trigger and the gun roared. The blast lit up the cabin for a split second, filling it with smoke and sparks. The bullet missed Elias by inches, splintering the wall behind him. The woman screamed, diving for cover. Elias grabbed his own rifle from the table. The next moments were chaos, firelight, shouting, gunpowder burning in the air. The two men circled each other in that small room, shadows flickering like ghosts on the walls. The father's fury was blind, unstoppable. Elias' fear turned to survival. He wasn't thinking anymore, just reacting. When the father fired again, Elias moved first. His own shot came almost without thought, deafening in the small space. The father staggered back, dropping his rifle. The lantern slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, flames licking up the dry wood. For a heartbeat, everything went still, the father's eyes wide, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Then he fell hard, knocking the table over as he went down. The woman screamed his name and ran to him, hands shaking, pressing against the wound as if she could hold him together. Blood spilled through her fingers, warm and dark against her skin. The smell filled the cabin, iron, smoke, and burning oil. Elias stood frozen, rifle still in his hands, unable to breathe. He hadn't meant to do it, not like this. He'd only wanted to stop him, to protect her. But the reality of what he'd done hit him all at once. The father's breath came in short, ragged bursts, eyes darting between them both. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. The fire spread quickly, catching on the curtains, the floorboards. The heat grew unbearable. The woman cried out, begging Elias to help, to do something. He dropped the rifle, pulled her back, but she wouldn't let go of her husband. "He's still alive," she sobbed. "We can't leave him." But the flames were rising fast now, smoke filling their lungs. Elias grabbed her, dragging her toward the door as the roof began to crack. The last thing she saw before the smoke swallowed the room was her husband's face, his eyes open, staring at her, filled with something she couldn't name, hatred, regret, or maybe relief. They stumbled out into the storm, choking, the fire behind them painting the snow orange. The cabin burned bright against the black sky, sparks flying into the wind. The roar of it swallowed every sound. They stood there in the snow, shaking, watching the flames devour everything. For a moment neither spoke. The woman fell to her knees, sobbing, her body trembling from cold and grief. Elias stood beside her, silent, his mind spinning. He had killed a man, maybe out of defense, maybe out of rage. He couldn't tell anymore. Then came the panic. The fire would draw attention, people would come. And when they did, what would they see? A dead man, his wife, and a stranger with a gun. No one would believe his story. No one ever had. He told her they had to go now before anyone arrived, but she shook her head, staring into the flames. "He deserved it," she whispered, almost to herself. "After what he did, after what he took." Her voice broke. "But God will never forgive me." Elias didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. He turned back toward the burning cabin, the snow melting beneath his feet. The smell of smoke and death filled the air, clinging to him like a curse. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped, maybe an animal, maybe someone watching. He didn't care anymore. The storm swallowed the sound, the flames, the screams. By dawn, the cabin was nothing but ash and ice. The fire had eaten everything, the walls, the blood, the truth. When the neighbors came, they found only the blackened remains and the charred shape of a man near what used to be the hearth. No one knew for sure what had happened that night. The woman was found wandering near the creek, barefoot, half frozen, muttering her husband's name. Elias was gone. And though the storm had passed, Hollow Creek would never be quiet again. The fire had burned more than a home. It had burned away whatever innocence the mountains had left. From that night on, the people whispered about the cabin that had burned in the snow, about the screams that still echoed through the pines, and about the woman who lost everything in one terrible night, her son, her husband, and the last piece of her soul. When morning came, Hollow Creek was covered in a thin layer of ice, as if the land itself had frozen in shock. Smoke still rose from where the cabin had stood, curling into the gray sky like a final breath. The fire had burned through the night, lighting up the valley like a warning. By the time the townsfolk arrived, there was little left to find, only the blackened shell of a life gone wrong. The preacher was the first to speak when he saw the body. "God have mercy," he whispered, removing his hat. The men behind him stood silent, their faces pale, their breath fogging in the cold air. The widow, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders, muttered that she'd heard the gunshot, thought it was thunder. Now she wished she hadn't looked out her window. Word spread quickly through the settlement. By midday, everyone knew the father was dead, the cabin gone, and his wife had been found half alive by the creek. No one had seen Elias since the fire. Some said he ran. Others swore he died in the flames and his body was lost in the ash. No one knew for certain, and maybe no one wanted to. The wife, her name was Mary, was taken in by the widow, who tried to care for her as best she could. But Mary didn't speak for days. She just sat by the window, staring at the mountains. Her hair was singed, her skin gray from smoke and frostbite. The preacher came by to pray with her, but she wouldn't look at him. When he asked what happened, she only said, "It's over." Nothing more. But nothing was over in Hollow Creek. Not really. The men buried the father on the edge of his land, under a tree that had somehow survived the fire. The ground was too frozen to dig deep, but they did what they could. No one said a eulogy. No one mentioned his name in prayer. It was as if they were afraid he might still be listening. For the rest of the winter, Hollow Creek held its breath. People locked their doors before dark and kept their lamps low. The sound of the wind in the trees started to make them uneasy. And when someone thought they saw movement near the old cabin ruins, a figure in the snow, watching from a distance, no one went to check. Mary's silence began to worry the widow. Some nights she would find her standing outside barefoot in the snow, looking toward the creek. Once she was found kneeling by the water, her hands red and raw, whispering her son's name over and over. The widow tried to comfort her, but Mary barely seemed to hear. Then one morning she finally spoke. "He's not gone," she said softly. "Elias, he promised he'd come back." The widow didn't know whether to believe her or fear her. In town, the nearest being 15 miles away, word of the killing reached the sheriff. He came riding up a week later, a heavy man with eyes that had seen too much. He walked the ashes of the cabin, asked questions no one could answer. He took notes in a small, damp notebook and told the townsfolk that if Elias was still alive, he'd be found. But deep down, even he knew men could vanish in those woods forever. The investigation went nowhere. The snow buried what little evidence there was: footprints, tracks, anything that could tell the real story. Some said Elias had fled to the next county. Others said Mary killed her husband herself and made it look like someone else had done it. A few even believed the father had shot himself, consumed by guilt. Every version of the story changed a little, depending on who told it and how much whiskey they'd had. But beneath the gossip, a strange kind of guilt settled over Hollow Creek. People realized how long they'd ignored the signs, the shouting at night, the bruises, the fear in Mary's eyes. They'd told themselves it was none of their business, that family matters were private. Now they weren't so sure. The preacher spoke of sin and punishment, but his sermons felt hollow. Even he couldn't make sense of what God would allow something like that to happen. Spring came late that year. When the snow melted, the land seemed changed, quieter, heavier. Wildflowers grew where the cabin once stood, but no one went near. Children were told to stay away, though a few dared each other to look for bones in the dirt. None ever found any, but one boy swore he heard someone crying near the creek when he was out there alone. Mary stayed with the widow for a few months, helping with chores when she was able. But she was never the same. Some days she'd talk as if her husband were still alive, as if he'd just gone into town and would be home soon. Other days she refused to speak at all. The widow grew to fear the nights most, the times when Mary would wake screaming, gasping for air, shouting her son's name or Elias. When the preacher came by again, he told her she should move on, that staying in Hollow Creek would only keep the pain alive. She nodded but didn't answer. A week later, she was gone. The widow found her room empty, the window open. All that was left behind was a folded piece of paper on the bed. It had only 3 words written on it: "I'm going home." No one ever saw her again. As the years passed, the story of that night became a legend told around fires and passed down like a curse. Some said Elias and Mary ran away together. Others believed he killed her too, out of guilt or madness. The more time passed, the less anyone knew what to believe. By 1910, the ruins of the cabin were almost gone, swallowed by grass and vines. Travelers passing through Hollow Creek sometimes asked about the burned place by the water, and the locals would tell them bits and pieces, enough to keep them from wandering too close. But those who lived there never forgot. The fire had changed them all. The widow lived long enough to see the next generation grow up. Now and then she'd think she saw movement in the trees, a tall figure watching from afar. Once she found footprints by the creek, too big to be a woman, too fresh to be old. She never told anyone. Some things, she figured, were best left buried. Years later, when people spoke of the Hollow Creek fire, they did so with lowered voices. It wasn't just a murder story anymore, it was a warning. About anger, about secrets, about what happens when fear and pride take root deeper than love. The preacher, before he died, said the devil didn't come to Hollow Creek that winter, he'd been living there all along. In the end, no one ever truly knew the whole truth. The mountains kept their silence as they always did. The snow would come and go, erasing footprints, swallowing memories. And somewhere in that quiet stretch of land where the cabin once burned, it was said that on cold nights you could still hear a woman's voice calling softly through the trees, a voice looking for forgiveness that never came. The trials that followed the murders in the Ozark Mountains became a dark chapter in Missouri's history. The newspapers called it the tragedy of Black Hollow, though those who lived nearby spoke of it in whispers long after the reporters had gone. What began as a quiet life among the trees and rivers ended as a lesson in how obsession, pride, and silence can rot the soul of even the most respected people. Samuel Deacon stood before the court, a man once admired for his discipline and faith, now hollowed by guilt and madness. His eyes darted from face to face as if he still expected someone to wake him from the nightmare. He barely spoke during the proceedings. When he did, his voice was rough and small, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. The jury didn't take long. The evidence, the confessions, the blood found in the cabin, all of it painted a clear, devastating picture. Samuel was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Some thought death would have been a mercy, but the judge believed the man should live long enough to face the weight of what he'd done. Rebecca never returned to the Ozarks after that. The shame clung to her name like a ghost. Though she hadn't been the one who pulled the trigger, people believed she had known more than she admitted. Her beauty, once admired, became something that haunted her. In every town she moved to, someone recognized her face from the old newspaper photos. She tried to build a quiet life in Kansas City, working under a different name, but guilt has a way of finding its way into every silence. Those who saw her years later said she still wore black, even in summer, as though mourning something she could never bury. The townspeople struggled to recover from the shock. In a place like the Ozarks, where everyone knows everyone, the betrayal felt personal. Families who had once gathered for Sunday dinners now sat in silence, afraid to speak of what had happened. The Deacon farm was left to rot, swallowed by vines and fog. No one dared buy the land. Hunters said they sometimes heard footsteps around the cabin or a voice calling softly through the trees. Others dismissed it as the wind. But no one ever stayed there after dark. The sheriff, who had once been Samuel's closest friend, never forgave himself for missing the signs. He had noticed Samuel's temper, his growing paranoia, but he chalked it up to the hardships of rural life. Years later, after retiring, he would tell his grandson that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a man you've shared a drink with. Sometimes, it looks like someone praying beside you. Justice, if it can be called that, came with a heavy price. Samuel's imprisonment didn't bring the dead back. It didn't erase the whispers that turned into legends or the fear that lingered in the hills. What the community learned instead was that evil could grow quietly in the heart of love, that jealousy, pride, and power can twist even good intentions into something deadly. In time, the story faded from the headlines, but not from the people who lived it. The children who had once run through the meadows near the Deacon farm grew up with that story carved into their memories. It was told at campfires and in hushed voices during storms. The moral was always the same, that darkness doesn't come from outside, but from within, and that it feeds on silence. Years later, when Samuel finally died in his cell, no one claimed his body. The papers didn't mention it. But a local reporter, curious about the past, visited the ruins of the old Deacon home. She wrote that the house had collapsed into itself, the roof sunken, the wood blackened by time. Only one thing remained untouched, the small iron cross Samuel had nailed above the door. It hung there still, rusted but strong, a reminder that faith alone isn't enough to keep the darkness away. The tragedy in the Ozarks wasn't just about murder. It was about the quiet breaking of people who could not face their own flaws. It showed how easily love can turn into control, how guilt can destroy more than violence ever could. The story became more than local gossip. It was a mirror for anyone who believed they were above temptation. In the end, justice did not heal the wounds it left behind. but it forced people to look closer at themselves, at what they hide, what they fear, and how quickly morality can shift when pride and jealousy take hold. The mountains still stand, quiet and beautiful, but beneath their calm surface lies a truth that no one forgets, that monsters are made, not born, and sometimes they wear familiar faces.